All right, we will get started. Welcome everyone. I'm Sarah Walker, the Walden Woods Project's Education Director. Thank you so much for joining us for the Art of Perception Lyceum. This event is brought to you by the Walden Woods Project, a nonprofit based out of Lincoln, Massachusetts that preserves the land, literature, and legacy of Henry David Thoreau to foster an ethic of environmental stewardship and social responsibility. And The Dial, a creative, collaborative community born out of the coronavirus quarantine. The Dial's byproduct is Symposium, a quarterly magazine by and for rational optimists. And lastly, this event is also part of the Concord Festival of Authors. So before we start, just to go over some Zoom housekeeping, this is a webinar, so you are only able to see the hosts and the panelists. Please use the chat function at the bottom of your screen if you're having tech difficulties, and I'll do my best to help. You can also use the chat to correspond more immediately with the audience. And there will be an audience Q&A during the last 20 or so minutes of our event. Please enter any questions throughout in the Q&A box, which is at the bottom of the screen, and we will address them later. And if you would like closed captioning, you can click the live transcript button at the bottom of the Zoom screen. And tonight we are joined by three terrific writers and philosophers. Jeffrey S. Kramer is the WWP Curator of Collections and resident Thoreau scholar. Jeff's works include I to Myself, an annotated selection from the Journal of Henry D. Thoreau, The Portable Thoreau, Solid Seasons, The Friendship of Henry David Thoreau, and Ralph Waldo Emerson, among others. He is a winner of the National Outdoor Book Award and a co-winner of the Boston Authors Club's Julia Ward Howe Special Award. Dr. Justin Atwell is an instructor in the program for writing and rhetoric at the University of Colorado Boulder, where he teaches various courses, including writing on science and society and technical communication and design. He holds a Master of Arts in Literature from Iowa State University and a doctorate of philosophy and rhetoric, writing, and culture from North Dakota State University. Dr. Atwell wrote his master's thesis, The Transcendentalist Hip Hop Movement, which explores various philosophical legacies of the 19th century transcendentalists through 20th and 21st century hip hop music. And tonight, our event will be moderated by the Dial team member, Garrett Allen. Garrett is a writer and teacher living in Los Angeles. He was a philosophy and Greek instructor at the University of Chicago, where he earned a master's degree. And he writes a weekly newsletter of short essays called Footnotes. And unfortunately, Caroline Williams had an unexpected conflict this evening and will not be able to join us. She sends her apologies, and we will miss her during this discussion. But I know the event will lend a great conversation between our three guests. And with that, I will turn it over to you, Garrett.
Thank you, Sarah. I'm super excited for this conversation. And my plan is to throw out a question, and Justin and Jeff, you guys can jump in when you're ready, when you have something to say, and toss it back and forth and toss it back to me. So to get us started, in his writing in Walden, Thoreau is constantly observing the world around him. He pays attention to the owls, the ants, corn. The book is full of woodchucks, blackberries, whippoorwills. It seems like one of the reasons he goes into nature, into the woods, is to reconnect with his perceptions, to reconnect with his immediate surroundings. And he does so with almost a religious fervor. But at the same time, he's interested in reworking or rewriting many of our cultural perceptions. He wants to rework our perception of property, of material possessions, of technology. One quote that stands out to me in this regard is, "A man is rich in proportion to the number of things which he can afford to let alone." So I see that as a rewriting of one of our cultural perceptions or stereotypes. And the first chapter of Walden tries to reframe what we think of as economy or making a living in a much larger context. So I'm excited to bring this panel together to talk about the art of perception, our sensory perception of the immediate environment, and larger issues of social perception or misperception. And as a kind of introduction, I was hoping you could say how the idea of perception comes up in the work you're interested in. Jeff, in Thoreau's writing, and Justin, in the hip hop artists you're most interested in.
All right. I think there's about 40 questions in there. I'll try to pull it apart. And I want to actually start with the first part of it, which was the idea of the spiritual connection to nature, in particular his observations. For somebody like Thoreau, who was a deeply spiritual person, and the realization that we're put on this earth for a relatively short time, and that God, or whatever you want to call whatever has created this magnificent earth on which we live, has created it in part for our enjoyment. And therefore, the thing that we need to do is to appreciate the world in which we live. And to do that, you would need to observe it, so that you're not tucked away in an office or a factory or on a farm 6 days a week. You are out there appreciating what you've been given. So I think one of the reasons Thoreau is so continually observant throughout his time is that he wants to really truly understand the world that he is sharing with others, whether it's other creatures or other humans or whatever. So I think that's an important part of his observational skills. So I want to jump over to Justin so we can kind of go back and forth a little bit.
Yeah, absolutely. So since we're bringing up the idea of perception, and this is a thing actually my students have been talking a lot about recently, is perception. And it's like, how do we define something? How do we know what is what? And one of my favorite lines from Thoreau that I can't find right now in my notes talks about the idea of imported nature. And one of this is, and Jeff, you know far more on this tip than I do, but one of my favorite interpretations of Thoreau, I think it's in Walking. He talks about being able to walk through, city parks and that type of stuff. And this imported nature having very much the same effect of what the nature outside of society has, right? So it's not like you have to go out, way out into the boonies to experience that. It's just, as long as you're around what is, nature, you're fine. Which makes me question this idea of perception, this idea of what is nature, what is society, right? And so, and I think that's at the core, obviously, of what a lot of Thoreau is doing. And I will say, for the benefit of the folks who are here who may not have, ever read my work or know nothing about hip hop music or any of that, a lot of what I talk about is this idea of hip hop music, in particular, Midwestern hip hop music is what I look at, but hip hop music in general has this thread that runs through it that I think is sort of born out of the Transcendentalists in a lot of ways, of looking back and saying, okay, well, what are the little bits of nature that we have, here, no matter where we are, right? And so I think that issue of perception is very important when it comes to that stasis point of like, what is nature, what is society? And so that's, when I hear that question immediately, I guess that's what I think of, is like, okay, what is our perception of nature? What is society? Is there really a divide there? Should there be?
If I could just jump back in. Thoreau said that he was part and parcel of nature. And one of those things that I think is interesting is how most people's perception of man, or human beings, whatever term we want to use, is that we are outside of nature. So we have humankind, and then we have the natural world, and that they are not the same. And I think once you consider yourself outside of the natural world, it's what allows you to cause harm to the natural world, because you don't care about it in the same way as you care about yourself or your family or your neighbors. But Thoreau looked at it that he is part and parcel of nature. So his body is the same as a fox or a duck or a goose. He's the same as any other animal throughout the natural world. So, and I think that's an interesting perception. It's an interesting way to look at his existence within the world as we know it.
Justin, you mentioned your work connects the transcendentalists, including Thoreau, with hip hop artists, contemporary hip hop artists, especially in the Midwest, independent artists. Those are two groups who aren't frequently brought together and talked about in the same sentence or paragraph. So how did you get interested in reading them into each other and comparing them?
I have a fantastic note here because I'm forever a big nerd, and so I have notes. But so one of the things, I guess, obviously, first of all, was a thematic connection that I looked at, and I wondered, is there really something about this? Is there really something behind this idea of, oh, the hip hop artists are saying the same thing that Thoreau and Emerson and Margaret Fuller and everybody else said, 100 years ago? And I was like, is there really something there? And one of the big things, and I guess this just resonates with me because it's 2020, it's 2021, whatever, is the idea of place and space being so important in those ways, and almost, I guess, defense of place and what is like home, not necessarily as like, this is mine, but like, this is where I am from. Like, let's protect this, let's do that sort of thing. And so really that's where the line came down. I'm trying again. I have my notes, and what good does it do me because I can't find the quote. But a big part of what I thought thematically linked them was just this idea of, well, we are identified with a certain space and we want to glorify this space, this sort of epidictic rhetoric of praising a place and whatever else, but praising a place for its unique features, not just because it's mine or because it's whatever else, but I am praising this place because it is what it is in the environment and exists as a unique space in the world. And that is a thread that I see that runs through. I mean, if you look at Jay-Z and Alicia Keys' New York State of Mind, I read that in the same way that I read Walden. Like I read that in sort of the same sort of way where it's like, well, here is this place, right, that has its unique characteristics, and we're going to lift those up. So that sort of is where that all comes from for me. And it's I think it's difficult because it's so different in terms of urban and rural and racial spaces and socioeconomic spaces and all of that. But it is, at the end of the day, to me, all about place and space. And so that's where it comes from for me.
Yeah, I find that fascinating. One thing I was thinking about in that context is that both hip hop artists and Thoreau have to establish that they are from a place and part of that place, and they're both interested in criticizing that place or bringing to light sort of some of the shortcomings of that place without alienating it to the point where they're no longer an insider. So I was wondering if you could talk about the way they can do both of those things, establish their credentials as belonging to a place, something that we see a lot in hip hop, people who are talking about their the neighborhood they come from or the city, but they also want to critique it, especially the hip hop artists that you're interested in, Justin. They want to critique, I mean, many elements of our society, but also hip hop. So they want to critique the art form that they're, the art form that they're using. But how do they manage that with also maintaining their credentials as from that place or practitioners of that art? And Jeff, I'm wondering how you see Thoreau managing that balance between establishing his credentials as an American writer, while also leveling serious and many critiques at his contemporaries.
Do you want to start, Justin, or?
It's up to you, Jeff.
Go for it.
I feel like I've been bogarting here, but yeah. I will just say I feel like that issue of critique is another through line that I missed here with the earlier question with transcendentalists and Midwestern hip hop music, in particular 2004 to 2012-ish. This idea of critique that we are not being, as an art form, as a community, as whatever else, everything that we could be, right? And so I think that's a big sort of through line there. But back to the now I feel silly. Back to the original question. Give me like the 5-second version of what that question was. Sorry.
Well, I was wondering how you see them managing this balance between establishing their credentials and praising the place they're from, identifying with it, and also putting themselves outside of it and saying, critiquing that group or our norms.
Yeah, absolutely. So I think a big part of that is really the Midwestern tendency, and anybody who's in the Zoom today who might be from the Midwest knows this idea of sort of Midwestern deflection, and this idea of it's not about me, it's about something else. It's about something else. It's about something else. And the very interesting thing, that's the through line that I see, I guess, with Midwestern hip hop is it's never it's about me. It's always it's about Minneapolis. It's about Kansas City. It's about Columbus. It's about whatever. And so it's this idea, I think, this subversion of self in favor of lifting up the place, I think is sort of that theme that I see there.
And I think Thoreau, in some ways, is almost the opposite of that, because he's so much about the personal pronoun I, and he talks so much about that he talks about himself because that is, who he knows best, of course, and therefore the criticisms he's leveling against society are also valid against himself as a member of society. So, and that we tend to sometimes think of Thoreau as somebody who has moved away from society as a way of criticizing it, but he never really did move away from society. He was always very much part of that society in which he lived. So even, for instance, living at Walden Pond, where most people have that perception that he was off on some kind of adventure for 2 years, not the case. I mean, he was going into Concord almost daily. He was visiting with people, friends, family, people were visiting him there. So it was a way to observe society, and it was a way to criticize it, but he's never leaving himself out of that equation. So it's never, I am this, you guys are this, and you need to fix yourselves. It's, we are all in this together, and how can we make this better?
And I guess I will make, Jeff, that's a very important distinction I should draw there, is a lot of these artists, as like deconstructionist guy, I will say, they say, oh no, it's not about me, it's not about me. But probably the most famous Midwestern underground rapper ever, Slug, will very rapidly say, oh, it's not about me, it's about Minneapolis, Southside for life. But at the same time, he will say, oh no, y'all aren't as good as me. I'm gonna stand over here and do the moonwalk while you're doing whatever you're doing over there, right? And so it is a very interesting thing of like, oh, it's subversion of self, but not really.
And some people, I mean, feel that Thoreau is very self-righteous, as if he is separating himself out. I am this person, and I am so much better than you. I'm trying to become me, but I don't think that's the case. Really, I don't think he's self-righteous at all. I just think he's on the right track and trying to get people to look at how they conduct their lives in a different way.
Mhm. Oh, and I'm not saying Thoreau's self-righteous either.
Right?
I'm just saying,
No, I yes.
I'm just saying there's plenty of folks who would make those claims who are.
Yes, that was not aimed at you.
Oh yeah.
So I want to go back to observation of the immediate environment for a second, because it's such a overwhelming part of Thoreau's writing. And I have another quote from Thoreau. So this is the start of the chapter Solitude. This is a delicious evening when the whole body is one sense and imbibes delight through every pore. And Jeff, I think that's in line with your comment about the reason for observation being enjoyment of creation. You know, he's saying his whole body is one sense and he's enjoying everything that's coming into it.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I'm curious if what other thoughts you have connected with that. And Justin, so I'm curious the way you see that spirit of observation reflected in the hip hop artists you're interested in. So I understand you were saying, they observe the world around them, the nature that they see, and the city that they see, I guess, and they don't make a strong distinction between outdoorsy nature and the urban life around them. But I'm wondering if any examples come to mind about their tendency to observation, or the role that contemplative observation of the environment plays in these artists.
So for the Thoreau part of it, I mean, one of my favorite quotations of Thoreau is, "Surely joy is the condition of life." So certainly it connects with your quotation, Garrett, that we are here to enjoy ourselves. And so that idea of opening your pores, just allowing everything to connect to you in various ways. And we look at iconic figures in a very sort of stone-like way, like they're statues, that they are just gravitas all the time, and not people who joked around or enjoyed things. And Thoreau was very joyous in a lot of ways. He played flute, he danced, he sang songs, he did all sorts of things. He played practical jokes on Emerson. I mean, there are things that we just don't think about Thoreau. His writings are full of puns and plays on words, because he just loves doing that behind the scenes. One of my favorite ideas of Thoreau is that which he talks about in his journal, I believe it is, that he would take his boat out onto Walden Pond, for instance, and let the boat just go wherever it wants. And he'd play his flute. And then he plays flute against the echoes on the pond. So he's improvising music as he's just floating on the pond. And it's just a beautiful idea. I mean, basically, he's kind of jazz. He's just improvising with himself and natural echo. But those kinds of moments that we start seeing Thoreau as this person who's just truly enjoying the world in which he lives is wonderful. I mean, we need to get rid of that deep voice when we read, "I went to the woods to live deliberately." I mean, there's just so much joy in Thoreau, and it's so easy to miss that. So I'm kind of glad you brought up that idea of that joyousness that he felt.
I will say, for me, and this is, of course, as an individual reader, my own sort of glossing of the text, as it were. But the idea of living with joy, I have always seen another through line, obviously, with Thoreau is the idea of authenticity, right? And so living authentically, doing those things. And that's a very, to tie this into what you were asking, Garrett, very clear through line to me in terms of, okay, well, wanting to live authentically, looking at the lived environment around me, natural world combined with society, whatever else, but looking at an authentic picture of the world. And you said specific examples, and one of these specific examples that I will give is a fairly obscure one, and so I apologize, but if anybody wants to go look at something on YouTube that has like maybe 50,000 views. There was a hip hop group in the mid 2000s in the Midwest, High Respects, HEIRUSPECS, and they were very, going back to our idea of space and place that we talked about earlier. They were very tied to the idea that they were not from the Twin Cities. They were not from Minneapolis. They were not from the suburbs. They were from St. Paul. And that was part of the thing that they would do. And so there is a song, which is a song called 10 Miles. And I think I have a chapter in my master's thesis, or maybe it's a paper I wrote something elsewhere. But I have a document I wrote once upon a time looking at this as sort of an analog for Thoreau's Walking, because it's just the lead MC of the group walking down the street for 10 miles, 5 miles one way, 5 miles back the other way to his house, and just narrating what he sees, right? And it's not necessarily, it's sort of the Emersonian idea of like the eye looking at the world, right? It's not necessarily a whole lot of judgment. It's nothing like that. It's just, here's what I see. And the chorus is something like, I walked 10 miles today just to see what I could see, right? And it's that whole idea of, we take in the world as it is around us and whatever else, and I am part of this and it is part of me. And I don't know, I went off there. I got excited about High Respects because you made me think about High Respects, but yeah.
Well, I think we connect the idea of observing the environment with joy and with living authentically. And perception of the environment is joyful when you're living authentically, which is difficult. And it's something both Thoreau and our hip hop artists have worked hard at. So I want to move on to a question about the artistic process and the role the artistic process plays in perceiving the world around us. So I think it's easy to think that perception of the world is easy. The world appears before us and we perceive it. We break it up into objects and we read them off the face of the world. But I think that's not how it works. Perceiving a situation or perceiving the society you live in is difficult and takes a lot of work, and takes a lot of reworking of the prejudices you've been brought up with, or kind of mining underneath the preconceptions that you have. And I'm curious what role art can play in that process. So for Thoreau, what role his writing plays in allowing him to perceive the world. So not just, recording his observations, but is actually a part of his process of observation. And if there's an analog to that question in the world of music, you know, we can talk about the artist walking down the street and recording what they're seeing and respecting it and enjoying it in that way. But is there also a element of the music that's, you know, the music is part of the process of perception and they're working toward a perception of their world or themselves?
I mean, for Thoreau, one of the things that I find when I talk to a lot of people is they forget about Thoreau as a writer. Excuse me. And so, and part of that's because his writing is so, it feels so seamless, and it feels like he is doing what Justin described as in the 10-mile walk, and what are all the things I'm seeing when I'm on that 10-mile walk. And I'm sure the hip hop artist in creating that piece of music is actually choosing, yeah, I'm seeing that people. I'm not going to talk about that one that I just passed by because that's not interesting to what I'm talking about. And the same for Thoreau, that, you know, when he is describing something at Walden, or he's describing when he goes on a walk, or he's climbing Mount Katahdin in Maine, there's this sense that he is literally just almost making a recording of what he's seeing along the way. And it's absolutely not true. There's a whole lot of artistic creation in the story he's telling you in each of his works, which we often forget. So I think the artistic temperament of a writer like Thoreau is not only that detailed observation, but how do I take those observations and then turn them into a narrative that will mean something to my readers, and make them think. I mean, one of the things I find most important about reading Thoreau is not actually the answers he has to give me about how he's conducting his life, but the questions he's asking himself about how he's conducting his life, because those are the questions that I find are very inspiring when I want to look at my life and where I'm failing in being a good person or a better person than I want to be or can be. So those questions are so important that he's asking, because they are meaningful to me in how I conduct my life.
A follow-up to that, Jeff. So Montaigne says in one of his essays that he's writing in order to figure out his own opinions. Mm-hmm. So that's why he's writing, is to learn who he is and learn what he thinks about things.
Yep.
And so put Montaigne at one end of the spectrum, and then at the other end of the spectrum, let's put someone who writes with the goal of convincing people. You know, they want to proselytize and spread their message. And this person knows what they think, and they're writing in order to, you know, to convince other people, or to with a political mission. Mm-hmm. So where does Thoreau fall on that spectrum?
Yeah, I mean, I find him close to the person who's trying to figure out what he thinks about something, because he is constantly reevaluating and rethinking things he's already thought before. So I like to talk about Thoreau because we have these iconic things of this is what's Thoreauvian. And I like to talk about Thoreau as the hermit who loved people, as the teetotaler who, you know, drank wine, as the social reformer, or the pacifist who said it's okay to pick up a rifle and kill or be killed, that their opposites exist in him, because he is constantly, he never actually ever stops evaluating, reevaluating, re-questioning what he thinks. So there is no thought that is so Thoreauvian that you can't find the opposite in. And I know after I talked about Thoreau being part and parcel of nature, somebody came in with a question in the chat where they said, didn't Thoreau say, I love nature partly because he is not man, or she's not man? And it's true. I mean, in that sentence, he is separating himself out, separating man from nature, but in other places, he's pushing them together. So you can always find the opposite in Thoreau. And that, I think, is closer to Montaigne, where it is, what do I actually think about this? And it's really, for somebody like Thoreau, it's what do I think about this today? Because tomorrow I could think something different. And I could certainly think something different a year from now or 10 years from now. So it's constantly changing.
If I could go back to that point that you raised, Jeff, about Thoreau as someone who is constantly evaluating and watching the world and trying to decide and all of that. I really like that, because the song that I referenced right before you said that, you said, well, I'm choosing this thing to put in there and this thing not to put in there. One of the very first lines of that song is, there's my neighbor. He doesn't even know he's going to be in this song. Like, and so it's just this idea of like, well, I'm moving through the world and everything else is moving through it at the same time. And so this idea of this, universal shared experience that at the same time is individual, which is very interesting. But going back to what you had said originally, Garrett, about this idea of like, how does, art help us interrogate this idea of perception, I think is part of the core of the question that we had leading into Jeff. I know I have some folks, at least, if you're spending a Thursday night watching a Zoom talk about Henry David Thoreau and perception and all of that, I'm sure somebody in there knows what grounded theory is. And I will say, one of my favorite things ever was an explanation of the idea of grounded theory, which was, in grounded theory, we walk into a situation and we look at it and we say, well, we don't really have a frame of reference for this, but we have all of the rest of experience. Let's take this snapshot out, turn it around, stick it back into experience, and see what it tells us about that. And I very much think that's kind of what Thoreau does, and what a lot of these artists that I'm talking about are trying to do as well, because it's like, well, I have my own individual experience and that's all I have. How do I use that, take it and flip around and make sense of everything else? Right.
Yeah, but so if I hear you right, it starts with the admission that we don't know how to make sense of this.
Exactly.
So it's that first moment that's really important, and I think yeah, that first moment is a very easy one to skip or overlook as we're going about our lives, and we perceive things that we're familiar with, and as we become familiar with them, we kind of stop perceiving them. We take them for granted, and it was one of Thoreau's constant missions to get people to stop taking it for granted, but to question that perception. And using the rest of his experience, as grounded theory would say. Justin, so one, I mean, we talked a little bit about critique and, as the other side to establishing your credentials. You establish your credentials, and then you can also offer critiques of your society for Thoreau, or for mainstream culture, mainstream rap, for the hip hop artists you're interested in. I'm wondering if you could just give a quick summary of what their critique was or is. So who are they being critical of, and what critiques did they offer?
So I don't, again, because we're in the Walden spot here, I don't want to hop too far off on the hip hop train. But you're asking specifically about hip hop artists that I looked at. What was their critique? Yeah. Oh, okay. So if y'all remember back in about 2003, the word bling bling entered the English dictionary. Because the Oxford English Dictionary for the first time as an official entry. And the world had a tizzy, because it was like, well, hip hop is now mainstream culture, blah, 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 and all of this kind of stuff. And the critique of not just Midwestern hip hop artists, but there was a very large divide in this early 2000s time between mainstream culture and independent culture, which is again where I draw one of those parallels with the transcendentalists. Hey, here's mainstream culture, here's us, right? And independent culture said, yeah, bling bling, that's great. We're glad that hip hop is in the mainstream, but we don't care about the crystal. We don't care about the gold chains. We don't care about all of that. We want to go over here, wear our backpacks and spit really, really complicated rhymes, right? Like that's what we want to do. And so that was kind of the I will say 1995 to like 2010 movement of independent hip hop music, particularly, as I said, centered in the Midwest, because the largest independent hip hop record label was in the Midwest and still exists. There was one in New York. Ironically, the one in New York died out in like 2005. And many of the artists from that record label are in the one in Minnesota now. So the idea of this independent culture of hip hop that's sort of at odds with the mainstream and critiquing, well, we're not being all that we could be. Y'all are being a little bit too materialist. We're going to go over here and, say complicated things. Now, obviously, we don't have time to get into it. There are a lot of complications where you can bring up issues that can make that problematic to say, well, you're obsessed with materialism, we're going to go say smart things. But the 90-second version of it is that basically that, hey, we have this mainstream movement that is obsessed with materialism and with, at the time, a lot of rampant sexuality and misogyny and whatever else. And then we have this over here that is our movement that is going to be counter to that. So. I think your mic might be off there, Garrett.
Yep, it was. Okay. Thanks for that summary, Justin. We're going to move now into some questions from the audience. So there's a question box. Click on it, ask your question. I will read them off. So here comes the first one. Do you think Thoreau's work as a surveyor, a very precise occupation, influenced how he perceived the natural world and described it in his books?
It might actually be the other way around. I mean, I think Thoreau had already developed a very precise and exact way of observing nature and recording nature before he actually started doing his surveys. So, but I think those things actually do work well together, the precision of his observations, precisions that he must need as a surveyor. And surveying, of course, also allowed him so much access to nature that he's actually performing a job that he gets to do outside, which is actually a wonderful thing. But I think that those two occupations, if you want to call them both that, were very connected. Yeah, good question.
Could I ask a question to piggyback off of that, off of Jeff, actually?
Please.
Yeah. So Jeff, I'm very curious because I've never thought about this before. And obviously you have read and written a lot more on Thoreau than I have. I talk about the rap music and sometimes the nature, but yeah, we think about this idea of Thoreau as surveyor, right? And as someone who has done surveying work, like I think of it as very precise. I think of that, but I never think of any of the surveying work I did as being related to actually like being out and enjoying nature. So do you think for him that experience of just being out in nature without the job attached to it was more of like a holistic experience, I guess, as a human, as opposed to like, hey, I'm doing work and I'm doing like, I'm curious about that.
Yeah, I mean, I would definitely say so. And I think, although, I mean, I'm implying that the fact that he did surveying outside allowed him some pleasure. It was still a job that he had to perform. And in many cases, he's surveying for what will actually be destructive to the natural environment, to cut down trees and to do things that are not for the best reasons if you're an environmentalist. So yeah, the experience would be completely different. When he's out there for himself, observing nature, much more holistic. I mean, everything is there, and it's not, he doesn't have to worry about getting the inches right or the, what he's going to get for his surveys. He's trying, when you hire a surveyor, you're trying to get the most land you can possibly get out of that survey. So yeah, it's a different experience.
I can't do the quote exactly, but there's some quote in Thoreau to the effect that the greatest thing in the world is a new prospect, and that I can get by taking a walk every morning.
Yeah. So
it's part of his critique of a mainstream traditional conception of wealth, but it also connects to his profession as a surveyor, I'm assuming, because that concept of a prospect is linked to surveying. But it also links to another question that I had, which is wordplay, the role of wordplay in perception. So Jeff, as you mentioned, Thoreau likes to play with his words. He likes to turn phrases around. He likes to sometimes corrupt words in order to make a point.
Yep, absolutely. He'd like to get to the root meaning of words, like to look at things in a different way than we would normally do. So a lot of times when you're reading Thoreau, if you take a word and go back to, for instance, its Anglo-Saxon meaning, it has a quite different meaning than it does in the present day, or Thoreau's present day. And so you get a completely different meaning when you read the text that way. But also, I mean, he is, puns are rampant in his works. Scatological humor. I mean, again, we read Thoreau so seriously that when you come across a line in Walden, for instance, where he says he's out watering the wildflowers, nobody stops to think you don't water wildflowers. You're urinating in the woods, and that's what he would be doing. When he talks about squatting on the land, on Emerson's land in particular, when he's squatting on the land, you know what he's doing. I mean, he has to take care of some of his bodily functions, but you read that so seriously in Walden. Oh yes, he's a squatter on the land. Oh yes, isn't that nice? He's watering the wildflowers. So again, because we treat these writers, and not just Thoreau, I mean, all of the writers that we read in such like a holy, put them up on a pedestal, we miss so much of what's going on in that writing.
Yeah. Justin, I have the same question for you about the role that wordplay plays in hip hop. So, what is there to say about how that functions, and does it have any role to play within the act of perception?
Yeah, I mean, again, I will come back to, this is less about wordplay, I guess, and more about just stylistics and approach, sort of rhetorical approach to rap music, and the folks that I've been talking about all night in terms of independent Midwestern hip hop music. Again, for folks who might not know out there, the gold standard in rap music is to say, I am the best, I am the best, I am the best. I have millions of dollars, gold chains, etc. Right? That is sort of the mainstay until about 5 years ago, when mainstream hip hop kind of went off on a schism. But when I was writing what I was talking about here earlier, a lot of that has to do, again, with this idea, not necessarily of I'm the best, I'm the best, I'm the best, but this idea of self-deprecation. And so one of my favorite lines that I will throw out there, again, just as an example, is from a group from Sioux Falls, South Dakota, of all places. And they rap the line, and it's got a nice little cadence to it, talking about wordplay. I got a 5-point buck and a big white truck. The Midwest is hell, right? And so this idea of, no matter what, yeah, we're going to sit here, we're going to be really fancy with the wordplay, we're going to do all these things, but at the end of the day, we're going to kind of subvert it. And the message is, no matter how well I can play with the words, it's all subservient to the overall message. Like, what is the overall thing that we are saying? So I don't know if that's a satisfactory answer to your question, but it's what came to my mind immediately when you said that.
What do Thoreau and Midwestern hip hop artists show us about the relationship between perception and time? Can different forms of art, music, or writing change our experience of time?
Yeah.
Ditto what he said. Yeah.
I will say, because I saw that there's somebody in the chat, or I guess it was in the Q&A, and I just saw somebody, the first line that I saw was, what might be suggested preparing of one's mind for a walk? And I didn't see the rest of it. But my immediate thought was back to a song that I wrote about, which is Atmosphere, probably the biggest independent hip hop group out there, whatever non-mainstream hip hop group out there. They have a song called Sunshine. And I would say, if you're preparing for a walk around Walden Pond and you want a little bit of an unusual start to your walk in terms of not what you expected, but still everything it should be, I would say you could do a lot worse than something like Atmosphere's Sunshine. Because yeah, I think it has that idea of communion with nature in it.
I agree, and I also think that with regard to the question about time, it connects with our discussion of place earlier, both in Thoreau and in hip hop. I mean, hip hop is often giving a story or a history of a place. It's an oral history of a place and telling what this place is about. And by choosing different narratives, you tell a different, you have different time frames and you have different actors in the story. So there's ways of, broadening or altering the time frame that hip hop artists can use.
I will say this is apropos not of Thoreau or of hip hop music, but talking about different times, different spaces, being out in nature. I will say, I myself am originally from rural eastern Montana, and part of my family is Native, part of my family is white, and so there are always very interesting discussions that come up when we go to various sites, obviously, where people say, isn't this nice? Isn't this nice? Like, imagine what it was like here 150 years ago. And I start to imagine it, and I'm like, this was probably horrific, actually, because we had a lot of problematic things that were going on at that time. But that ability to be able to experience that place and think about it in that time, and think about it when you are there in that present moment, I think is actually a very, really useful tool that I will say I haven't thought too much about, and I'm going to bring up with my nephews the next time we're hanging out in Medicine Rock State Park in Montana.
Jeff, do you have any response from the Thoreau side about the way that Thoreau wants to change our experience or perception of time?
I mean, all I can say is that
his own art changing his perception of time.
Yeah, I mean, when he's giving a narrative, for instance, he's does not pay much attention to time. He is merging things that happen at all different times. If you look at something like Walden, for instance, which is written over a 9-year period of time, he is culling things from his journal over not just those 9 years, but from things that happened years and years before he ever went to Walden Pond, and from years afterwards. So that he's creating a narrative that pretty much covers probably like 15 years of his life. But in creating that narrative that you're reading, you don't see that. So he's playing with time like in that way. He also condenses 2 years at the pond to one, his 2 weeks on the Merrimack River to one. He's doing various things like that. But I think mostly the way he is able to be not pay attention to the time frame of any particular part of the story from his journals that he's pulling to create a different narrative.
That's interesting. I see him. I mean, you could just say he's taking liberties with time, but the question is why is he taking those liberties? And it fits the story that he's telling. And it also reminds me of his understanding of culture. You know, he often writes about writers or thinkers or artists from other ages as if they were present to him.
Yeah.
And, you know, in an important way, they are present to him. So participating in art allows him to, you know, collapse huge spaces of time so that he can sit next to Homer or, you know, engage with humans throughout history. And that's one thing that art does for him.
Absolutely. I mean, when he's going down the Concord and Merrimack Rivers, he is referring to so many other texts and historical documents and poetry and all of this that he's just merging into that very contemporary story that he's telling on the river.
Can I ask a real quick question again, Jeff, just to nerd out? Doesn't he also in Walden talk about the books that he has in the cabin? And there's like 2 shelves, I think, that are always there, and those are the books. Or am I?
He does talk about having books at Walden. The only one we know he had there was Pope's Homer. We don't actually know the other volumes, but we know he had a small library there.
Gotcha.
Yeah.
If Thoreau were alive today, how do you think he would view human perception of climate change risk, media framing and influence, and attitudes of concern or unconcern? So that's a great question about Thoreau. And
yeah.
I want to broaden it too, to see if in contemporary hip hop, so this is, you know, Justin, the period that you've been talking about mostly is in the 2000s to 2010, but in contemporary hip hop, you know, what do you see, and is there any critique of our relationship to the environment in contemporary hip hop? Go ahead, Jeff.
I mean, from the Thoreau vein, this is a really hard question. This comes up so often, Thoreau in relation to climate change and what his position would be, and so let me start off by saying it's so difficult to take a mid-19th century person and plop them into a 21st century conundrum and say this is what he would think, because we never know what Thoreau think. In fact, what we talked about not too long ago was the fact that he's always changing his mind. So you can't even predict anything that Thoreau would say about any particular topic. You could never predict his writings about John Brown from what he wrote in Civil Disobedience. Absolutely impossible. You couldn't even believe that's coming from the same human being. So if we look at Thoreau in the mid-19th century and his attitude is that the natural world changes, that things come, things go, that different species come in, different species go out, that there's a constant flux. And his experience, or what he thought, was a faith that the natural world will take care of itself. Now, he also does talk about that, you know, different groups, including mankind, could go away. That's not the end of the world. It's just the end of the world for mankind. So it's hard to predict what his position would be if he were alive today looking at climate change. Would he just say, well, we might not be here in 50,000 years. The world's going to be here, but we're not, and that's natural? Or would he say, now it's more realistic, I think we might want to do something different? It's very difficult to even hazard a guess at what Thoreau might think if he were here today. Did I do that without getting in too much trouble? Hopefully.
Did you say without getting in too much trouble?
Yeah.
I think you'll be okay.
All right.
I will say for the Thoreauvian part, just because I love using the word Thoreauvian, I would say at his least radical, I think Thoreau would say, as Jeff said, the world changes, whatever. At his most radical, I think Thoreau would chain himself not to Bezos or Musk's rocket or anything, but to the gate outside of it. I think that would be the most radical when we're talking about climate change. But if we're talking about hip hop music and addressing climate change, I think there has been a lot more of this in recent years. I think of groups like Run the Jewels, for example, who have had major mainstream success and are very political, unlike a lot of hip hop groups before them who might have had mainstream success in the last 10 years. But also address environmental issues and climate change issues, not just through their music, but through their social media and that kind of thing, which for me as a scholar with the heaviest of air quotes, is always the toughest thing to look at, because I'm like, well, yeah, that's their Twitter. What does that matter? But then I look at it and I'm like, well, it's got 55,000 likes. So somebody's paying attention to it, right? And I see a lot more of that in mainstream hip hop music, where people will make their songs and I muted myself. People will make their songs and their songs will be, Lil Nas X, controversial for a whole bunch of other reasons, but then he'll get on his Twitter and he will say, no, we need to address this climate change issue. And we have, 500,000 people who are responding and interacting with that. And I'm kind of like, well, can we really separate the art from the artist? And that's where that comes down. That question for me is very tough to answer, but there definitely is a lot more engagement with those climate change style issues, in particular urban issues, things like not just climate change, but things like food deserts. That type of stuff is a lot more prominent right now in mainstream hip hop and that type of stuff, which is heartening but also terrifying, right?
I want to ask one more question about Walden Pond. What might be a suggested, we mentioned this previous, so we're going back to it. What might be a way of preparing one's mind for a walk around Walden Pond, including visiting the site of his hut? What might be a worthy way to encourage oneself to take something away from the walk that can enrich your life? So Justin, you already mentioned your suggested way of preparing. Yeah, what else?
Well, I think so Walden Pond gets a lot of visitors. During the summer months, it is absolutely crazy. So I would say for anybody who really wants to prepare themselves for Walden Pond, one, they should read Walden or read some of Thoreau's nature writings just to get a sense of what it meant to him. But I would pick a season where you're not going to get a lot of people or as many people. So you don't want the summer and you don't want foliage season. So go in the winter, and go in the winter bright and early in the morning before people are up and about. Go at like 5 in the morning or 6 in the morning. Experience a nature walk that Thoreau would have loved. He would love doing that when there's nobody around, or an evening walk when there's few people around. But you want to try to experience Walden, and it's very difficult to do at a time when there are fewest people there, so that you are getting as close as possible to what Thoreau may have experienced. It's very hard to do because so many people want to be there. It's such a beautiful place, and it's a swimming hole, and people go there for Thoreau. So it's a very, very busy place. But trying to find a way to experience it with less people around will be a more enjoyable experience in the long run.
Okay, I think that is a good place to stop, and hopefully everyone will start planning their trips to Walden Pond this winter, just in time. Thank you so much, Jeff, Justin, and Garrett. This was a lot of fun. Thank you for the audience for being here tonight and for such insightful questions. As you know, we offer these virtual events for free and will continue to do so. If anyone can donate to our virtual events, that is so appreciated from us, the Walden Woods Project. And for those that already have, thank you very much. I will post the link for donations in the chat. Also check out Symposium magazine that the Dial puts out bi-monthly, Garrett?
Quarterly.
Quarterly, okay.
So yeah, once a season, but we have one coming out in the next couple weeks.
Okay, great. And we will have another virtual event in November. Now Comes Good Sailing, and Jeff will be moderating that event with other contributors to a Henry David Thoreau essay collection. So hope to see you all for that, and you can go to walden.org to register. And thank you, everyone, and hope you have a great night.
Yeah, thank you, Sarah. Thank you, Jeff and Justin.
Thank you for being part. Yes.